Today, we announce the unsealing of sex trafficking charges against Jeffrey Epstein.
Breaking news this hour, officials say multimillionaire Jeffrey Epstein has taken his own life.
Hello and welcome to this special edition of The Nexus. Today, we are looking at one of the biggest stories of 2019, the life and death of arguably the world's richest convicted sex offender, Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein's arrest in July was big news, not just because he was wealthy, but because he was well connected to presidents, businessmen, even royalty. He was indicted on federal sex trafficking charges in the summer, but as many predicted, he never made it to trial. He was found dead in his jail cell in August. The official coroner called it a suicide. Other experts disagreed. The scandal didn't quite die with Epstein. The questions about his former friend, Prince Andrew, kept coming, and the prince's attempt to set the record straight about their relationship in an interview with the BBC backfired spectacularly. Well, we'll get to all of that in just a moment, but first, let's look at how the story broke back in July when Epstein was arrested and charged.
Today, we announce the unsealing of sex trafficking charges against Jeffrey Epstein. The victims, all underage girls at the time of the alleged conduct, were given hundreds of dollars in cash. As alleged, Epstein also paid certain victims to recruit additional girls to be similarly abused. This allowed Epstein to create an ever-expanding web of new victims.
Billionaire businessman Jeffrey Epstein was arrested in New York Saturday on federal charges related to sex trafficking.
Epstein was arrested when his private jet landed from Paris.
Agents executed a search warrant on his mansion in New York City.
Inside, investigators found hundreds of female nude photographs, some of the photos seeming to show underage girls.
He is now facing up to 45 years in prison on charges that he was running a sex trafficking ring in the early 2000s that included underage girls as young as 14 years old.
Jeffrey Epstein traveled in highly influential and wealthy social circles. He has been tied to former President Bill Clinton, as well as Great Britain's Prince Andrew and even current President Trump.
A tape in the NBC archives of a Mar-a-Lago party shows Trump giving Epstein his personal attention.
I had a falling out with him a long time ago. I don't think I've spoken to him for 15 years. I was not a fan of his.
If you're in his orbit and you were doing things that you shouldn't have back in the early 2000s, you ought to be very, very concerned right now.
This is the second time federal prosecutors have gone after Epstein. Back in 2008, there was outrage after federal prosecutors struck a plea deal.
The agreement allowed Epstein to avoid federal sex abuse charges and a possible life sentence.
According to prosecutors, he is, quote, not reformed, not chastened, he is not repentant.
Well, shortly after the arrest, we interviewed one of Epstein's former friends from back in the 80s, the New York journalist and author Jesse Kornbluth, and he shocked us with an anecdote involving his fiancée at the time. How did you get to know Jeffrey Epstein back in the day?
We met at a party. He started telling me stories. He knew who I was, and he knew his stories were fascinating. There were stories about him as a bounty hunter. He would help people in America track down money stolen by dictators in Africa, and other times he would help those dictators hide their money. And I thought he would make a great subject, so I started to see him a bit. And then things got strange. He asked me to accompany him to a law firm where he was going to serve a subpoena. We went to this firm and he didn't get past the receptionist. It made no sense to me that someone who did the work he did was doing what a process server would do. And I lost interest in the project, but he did not lose interest in me. The night before I was to marry a woman he had met, a beautiful, talented writer, he called her at our home and suggested that since this was her last night of freedom, she might come over and have sex with him. She thought he was kidding, but he wasn't. And then, as my ex-wife reminds me, something else happens. Very soon after, a man representing himself as me started calling women asking for a date. Epstein was the caller. He didn't seem to realize he was calling friends of ours who got back to us and said, someone is impersonating you. The question, why would someone impersonate me? This sounds self-referential, but let me be brief. I was a star writer at New York Magazine. I had this fantastically talented, beautiful wife, and the most important thing of all, I was brilliantly educated at Harvard, and it's the Harvard thing that is the key to this particular story. Epstein was obsessed with Harvard. You can see photos with him in Harvard sweatshirts. He gave Harvard a lot of money. He courted Harvard scientists. And in some ways, one of the tragedies of Epstein is he was, a poor kid, didn't graduate from college. He was the little match boy, and he was desperate to be inside the elite. And the way he found to do that was by dealing with the sexual peculiarities of very important rich people and compromising them.
Are you saying, Jesse, that that is his great ladder, if you like, up to the elite, rather than his brilliance as a financier?
There is no proof that Jeffrey invested a single dollar for anybody, maybe Leslie Wexner. But I think the trove of stuff that came out of his townhouse might contain the kinds of material that important people would not like to have publicized. And if Epstein raised money by informing those people that he had that stuff, then they might invest in his funds. That is the theory I find most palatable to explain how Epstein has a single dollar.
Right. Well, you mentioned the raids. Let's go to Yasmin now. Yasmin, the raids, the indictment, all of these things happened at the same time. Let's look at the indictment. Some 14 pages long. Very interesting and shocking details in here. 2 counts. This is the most important thing. Conspiracy to commit sex trafficking and sex trafficking. Now, for the layman watching, what do those terms mean?
So these are federal charges that are brought under a federal anti-trafficking law that we have in the United States called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. They're very serious charges. It basically alleges that Epstein engaged in some type of activity, including recruiting, obtaining, maintaining, soliciting individuals under the age of 18 for the purposes of a commercial sex act. And the charges that are specifically alleged here carry a 10-year minimum. So very, very serious charges, and then also adding in the conspiracy charges.
Let's talk about why now. New York has picked this up where seemingly in many people's eyes, Florida failed. Jesse, why now?
You have to remember, Epstein was arrested, and then there was the raid. That would have been a very bold thing if they had arrested him and the raid produced nothing. But the raid produced just a treasure trove of potential evidence. I have to think that behind this whole event is an insider, an employee, a friend who blew the whistle and gave prosecutors the hint that it was worth doing this.
Well, we caught up with Jesse a few months later, after Epstein died in his jail cell. His death, of course, sparked immediate conspiracy theories fueled by a string of mishaps that made it very difficult to establish exactly what happened. Take a look.
A lot went wrong in New York City's Metropolitan Correctional Center during Epstein's time there. So much so that the US Attorney General launched an investigation citing serious irregularities. For starters, Epstein was meant to have a cellmate at all times, but just hours before his death, his cellmate was transferred out and not replaced. Also, Epstein was placed on suicide watch after being found unresponsive with injuries to his neck in late July. But he was taken off the list just 6 days later. Even after being taken off suicide watch, Epstein's cell was meant to be checked every 30 minutes by a guard. But at the time of his death, the guards had fallen asleep and the cell wasn't checked for 3 hours. And while there are no cameras inside the cells, the two placed outside are impossible to check because both of them malfunctioned that night.
Well, in addition to all that, we have Michael Barton, a well-regarded forensic pathologist, and he explains why he thinks it might be murder.
Are you saying you don't think it was suicide?
I think that the evidence points toward homicide rather than suicide.
Why?
Because there are multiple 3 fractures in the hyoid bone, the thyroid cartilage, that are very unusual for suicide and more indicative of strangulation, homicidal strangulation.
Well, we discussed the circumstances of his death with Jesse, as well as Lisa Bloom, the high-profile lawyer representing a number of Epstein's victims. Jesse, when we did the first show on Jeffrey Epstein, after he'd been arrested and put into prison, a lot of the people who made comments on our YouTube channel said he'll never make it to trial. Powerful people will get to him. What do you think they meant by that?
Well, we have all watched hundreds of hours of police shows and read bushels of thrillers. What we instinctively believe is that everything is a conspiracy, that the fix is always in. The fact is that isn't always the case. There is human error. What's noticeable in this particular story is how much human error there is. And therefore, you have to ask. But the likelihood of us finding out, well, Fox will find out, because Fox will find out that Hillary Clinton strangled Jeffrey in his cell.
Well, she can't be everywhere at once, surely. Lisa, as a legal mind, you look at all these mishaps in jail, and you look at the fact that before he killed himself, he apparently was unresponsive with a neck injury. Do you find it conceivable that this could have been allowed to happen in a Manhattan jail?
Well, if it was allowed to happen, meaning the suicide, I think human error is the normal explanation for things going wrong, but there's just too much human error here. There's too many coincidences, and I don't believe in coincidences. Both cameras are not working. How hard is it in 2019 to have a working camera? We all have them on our phones, our iPads, our computers. We all own about 10 working cameras. They couldn't have one working camera on this high-profile guy who had previously attempted suicide. Come on. I do not buy it. I think it is likely there's a homicide, or, as some of my clients think, perhaps he's not even dead at all. Perhaps he was spirited away and somebody else's body was replaced.
Are you serious?
That's a crazy theory, I admit. But it's also crazy to suggest that this man molested hundreds or perhaps thousands of girls with the help of a lot of high-profile people. And that is what turns out to be a factual situation.
Yeah. Jesse, a final question for you. You did know Jeffrey Epstein back in, what was it, the 80s? And he made an indecent proposal to your fiancée on the eve of your wedding. We know that story already. But for what you know of him, do you think he had it in him to kill himself?
The one thing I can say as a novelist, which is what I do now, is that having created a trust a few days before, which protected his assets, it is possible that Jeffrey made a calculated business decision that he was going to be finally humiliated by everyone he cared about, that he was going to spend 30 to 40 years, the rest of his life, in jail, and decided, as I say, in a calculated decision to kill himself. Possible.
Well, the shockwaves from Epstein's arrest and death spread right across the Atlantic, where one member of the royal family found himself under increasing scrutiny. Prince Andrew had been friends with Epstein, staying at his house even after he'd been convicted. One of Epstein's alleged victims claims he'd forced her to have sex with the prince. Andrew, who is 8th in line to the throne, decided he wanted to tell his side of the story. But the interview with the BBC was a disaster for him.
The PR crisis that's engulfing the royal family is showing no sign of slowing down after that train wreck interview.
Prince Andrew's attempt to explain his friendship with accused sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein backfiring.
This interview sparking an immediate firestorm.
Avalanche of backlash.
It was a car crash interview.
He gave the most royally out-of-touch defense we have ever heard.
You were staying at the house of a convicted sex offender.
It was a convenient place to stay. The problem was the fact that once he had been convicted,
You stayed with him.
I stayed with him, and that's the bit that as it were, I kick myself for on a daily basis.
One of Epstein's accusers, Virginia Roberts,
Yeah.
has made allegations against you.
I have no recollection of ever meeting this lady. But we can't be certain as to whether or not that's my hand on her, whatever it is, left side.
You think that...
Because I have no recollection of that photograph ever being taken.
Wow, I get the feeling that the prince is actually finished for life as a royal.
British papers reporting this morning that the Queen fired her son.
I have asked Her Majesty if I may step back from public duties for the foreseeable future, and she has given her permission.
My gosh, he has let the royal family down, and he's let the Queen down.
We have never, ever had a story like this.
A member of the royal family stepping aside from their official role due to controversy is unprecedented in the modern era.
Prince Andrew would have said, I need to step down, or was he pushed?
Pushed, I think, in a word.
Prince Andrew will be stepping away from all of his 230 charity patronages.
No charity wants to be associated with a guy who appeared to be sucking up to a paedophile.
A British newspaper is reporting the FBI is now looking into how it can interview Britain's Prince Andrew over his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein.
So thanks to the prince's interview, what was meant to be damage control has now turned into complete chaos for the royal family.
Well, shortly after that interview, we spoke to the Queen's former press secretary, Dickie Arbiter. Now, Dickie had always warned that Andrew should never give such an interview. We asked him how he knew it'd be such a mess and what's next. Dickie, I'm going to start with you. And we're going to look back a few years here to an interview you gave in which you warned that Prince Andrew should definitely not do such an interview.
There's been a suggestion that maybe the Duke of York should come out and say something. Alan Dershowitz has done it in the States, but then Alan Dershowitz is a trained lawyer. He's trained to think on his feet. He's trained to talk, and he was giving an interview. I don't think the Duke of York should give an interview, and at the moment, Buckingham Palace are handling it absolutely right.
Up to Dickie then. How did you know that it was going to be such a bad idea even then, Dickie?
I knew it was going to be a bad idea, given the man himself. Prince Andrew is not the brightest bunny on the planet. He's not very good at expressing himself, and if he does it in a sort of bullying manner. And he was certainly the wrong person to speak in front of the cameras, to go for an interview. Well, if he thought it was an exercise in crisis management, all he did was manage a crisis. And my goodness, we've seen rafts of media coverage, not just in the UK, but global coverage on radio, on television, in the newspapers, in magazines. This is just something that will never go away. And who told him to do it? It beggars belief, because I believe he was pushed by his private secretary, and she's been moved sideways.
Now, Dickie, look, he is accused by Virginia Roberts of having sex with her when she was 17 and was allegedly being trafficked by Jeffrey Epstein. He is a public figure. He represents the country. Doesn't the British public deserve an answer from him, an account from him?
He is a public figure. The British people do deserve some sort of explanation. He tried to give an explanation, but he mucked it up. And he should, unless you are au fait with how to talk to television interviewers, present yourself on television, you shouldn't do it. Even the best media training in the world wouldn't have helped him on that one.
And which part of the interview did you find the most damaging?
I found it damaging from the beginning to the end. I mean, he made some ridiculous assertions when he said it was convenient to stay at Jeffrey Epstein's house, Jeffrey Epstein being a convicted sex offender. I mean, how stupid can you get? to say it is convenient to stay in a criminal's house. Somebody who had been released from jail, having been sent to jail for 18 months, and facing charges.
And he gave the interview at Buckingham Palace. What did the Queen know about it, if anything?
Queen probably knew absolutely nothing about it. There was a lot of speculation that the Queen was told about it. The way Andrew operates is that the Queen was informed, and I say that again, informed that he was doing an interview. She was probably no wiser than anybody else what the subject matter of the interview was until it came to light on that Saturday evening.
And some commentators are saying that because the royal family lost control of the Andrew situation, you know, the interview went ahead, that there's a lack of discipline there, what they call institutional decay. The strong hand of advisors has now sort of given way to the hooray Henrys who just acquiesce to whatever the royals want. Is any of that true?
Well, the biggest problem in Buckingham Palace is that if the principal doesn't tell you they're going to do something, and I go back to my own days with Charles and Diana. Diana used to do some things. I'd read about it in the paper the next day and say, well, why didn't you tell me? Oh, I forgot. And that's the way some members of the royal family operate. Certainly Prince Andrew. He doesn't tell anybody what he's doing, so consequently the communications office were left completely in the dark.
One last question before I open it up to everybody else. Did Prince Andrew decide to step down from royal duties and to separate himself from his 230-odd patronages, or was he forced to, and if so, by whom?
Well, it's a question of did he jump or was he pushed?
That's more succinct, yes.
Yeah, well, he was pushed by the media, and he was jumped on by the Queen and the Prince of Wales that he's got to back off, and back off he has done. And I personally feel there's no way back for him.
Speaking of the media, Andre Walker, some of your contemporaries are calling this the biggest scandal of a generation. What do you think?
I mean, I think it's an unbelievable situation. I mean, here is a man who has proved himself genuinely to be a crass, talentless moron, bleeding off, the British state. I mean, let's just remind ourselves about some of the pathetic excuses he offered. First of all, he claimed, unbelievably, that he never wears a suit when he's in London, despite there being photos of him not wearing a suit. And then he said that he never sweats, which is unbelievable as a claim. And my favourite thing, of course, was when he made the suggestion that he couldn't possibly have been at Tramp's nightclub because he was at Pizza Express, failing to note that nightclubs open far later in the evening than restaurants do. Look, I think it's good that we're rid of this man. I think that we need to be incredibly careful and extremely forensic in our questioning of his actions, not least because he appears to be phenomenally wealthy, having really quite a small income, apparently around being worth £57 million, but only having an income of £270,000. And it's all the usual story that we hear with the talentless children of famous people, whether that be Mark Thatcher, Hunter Biden, or Prince Andrew, hanging around with Azerbaijan, hanging around with Arab royal families, friends with the oil and gas industry, dodgy as sin.
OK, thank you for that. Let's just take a moment to look at this photograph here, which apparently shows Prince Andrew with his arm around one of Epstein's alleged victims, Virginia Roberts. And in the background, we see Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein's girlfriend, who it's said recruited young women and girls for Epstein to abuse. Now, the prince basically said that his main friendship was with Ghislaine, but considering the allegations against her too, is this really any better? What do you think, Dickie?
Well, it doesn't matter whether it's with Ghislaine or Jeffrey Epstein, they're both birds of a feather flock together. About that photograph, in that interview, he said he believes that photograph, and he doesn't deny it's him, but he does question whether that was him with Virginia Roberts Guthrie. Maybe it was a doctored photograph. But he did say in that interview he believed the photograph was taken in an upstairs room and he's never been there. So how does he know it was an upstairs room if he'd never been there? So, there was a contradiction. I don't think, you can separate the two. Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein were one of the same.
Dickie, has this new generation successfully detached itself from the tarnished reputations of the previous one, or will they not be able to escape the shadow of, Prince Andrew for a start?
Scandals come and go, blips come and go. The Queen survived Annus Horribilis. she survived and the monarchy survived the aftermath of the death of Diana, Princess of Wales. I think we've got to look at this in its context, the Andrew interview. It's a one-off member of the royal family going wild and not telling anybody what he's doing, and he suffered the consequences. The rest of the royal family will continue with what they do extremely well. William and Harry and their respective wives will do what they do extremely well. Harry and Meghan, albeit, have gone for a short break, but they'll be back. They'll be back with a clap of thunder early in the new year. And I believe the monarchy is secure. The institution is secure.
Well, that was Dickie Arbiter there, closing out the show, a man with a great deal of experience when it comes to the royals. Pay attention to what he has to say. It was one of the biggest stories of 2019, and it's likely to keep rumbling on into 2020, and we're going to be here to cover it for you. Till next year then, goodbye.